The billionaire was feared by everyone, except one small child who knocked on his door. Alexander Crane didn't believe in second chances, warm gestures, or the inherent goodness of people. At 33, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 continents, accumulating wealth that most couldn't fathom in 10 lifetimes. But money, he'd learned, didn't buy loyalty. It bought fear, and fear was far more reliable. His penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian building in Manhattan, a glass and steel monument to his success. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that never slept, though Alexander rarely looked at it anymore. Beauty had become irrelevant to him, just another commodity he could purchase but never truly possess. The staff who maintained his residence knew the rules: be invisible, be silent, be efficient. They moved through the sprawling rooms like ghosts, completing their tasks and disappearing before he could notice them. His assistant, Margaret, had worked for him for 7 years and could count on one hand the number of times he'd asked her a personal question. His board members trembled before him. His competitors went pale at the mention of his name. Even the doorman of his building, a former Marine who'd seen combat, couldn't quite meet his eyes. Alexander preferred it this way. Emotion was a weakness, connection a liability. He'd learned that lesson at 23, when his business partner and best friend since college had embezzled millions and disappeared, leaving Alexander to pick up the pieces of their company alone. The betrayal had carved something out of him, something he'd never bothered to replace. On a gray Tuesday in November, Alexander returned to his penthouse after a particularly brutal board meeting. He'd fired 3 executives before lunch and dismantled a competitor's acquisition attempt before dinner. It had been, by his standards, a productive day. He poured himself a scotch, aged 25 years, costing more per bottle than most people's monthly rent, and stood by the window, the amber liquid catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the clouds. That's when he heard it, a soft knock on his door. Alexander frowned. No one knocked on his door. The private elevator required a key card and a biometric scan. His scheduled appointments came through Margaret, who always called ahead. He considered ignoring it, but the knocking came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a small voice. "Hello? Is somebody there?" He set down his scotch and crossed the marble foyer, irritation building with each step. He yanked open the door, ready to unleash his fury on whatever incompetent staff member had allowed someone to breach his privacy. Instead, he looked down. A little girl stood in his doorway, no more than 3 years old, with a tangle of dark curls and enormous brown eyes. She wore a yellow dress with flowers on it, slightly rumpled, and held a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. She looked up at Alexander without a trace of fear, her expression one of curious concern. "Are you sad?" she asked. Alexander stared at her, his prepared tirade dying in his throat. "What?" "You look sad," the child said matter-of-factly. "My mama says when people look sad, we should be kind to them." She held out her rabbit. "You can hold Mr. Flopsy if you want. He makes me feel better when I'm sad." For perhaps the first time in a decade, Alexander Crane found himself completely at a loss for words. He looked down the hallway, searching for whoever was responsible for this child, but the corridor was empty. "Where's your mother?" he managed. "Working," the girl said. "She cleans the big rooms. I was playing hide-and-seek with Mr. Flopsy, and he hopped all the way up here." She giggled at this, as if the stuffed animal had truly acted of its own accord. "I'm Lily. What's your name?" "Alexander," he said automatically, then wondered why he'd answered at all. "That's a very long name," Lily observed. "Can I call you Alex?" "No one calls me Alex." "Oh." She considered this, then brightened. "Can I be the first one?" Before Alexander could respond, he heard rapid footsteps and a woman's voice calling out in obvious panic. "Lily. Lily, baby, where are you?" A young woman appeared at the end of the hallway, her face flushed with worry and exertion. She wore the uniform of the building's cleaning service, dark pants and a polo shirt with the company logo. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her features, while strained with anxiety, were delicate and kind. When she saw Lily standing in Alexander's doorway, the color drained from her face. "Oh my God," she breathed, rushing forward. "Mr. Crane, I am so sorry. Lily, come here right now." "But Mama, I was just—"
"Now, Lily."
The woman's voice was gentle but firm. She scooped the little girl into her arms, holding her protectively. "Mr. Crane, please, I apologize. My childcare fell through at the last minute, and my supervisor said it would be okay if I brought Lily as long as she stayed quiet in the service area." I turned my back for 1 second, and her voice cracked slightly. "It won't happen again. I understand if you need to report this." Alexander watched the fear in the woman's eyes, the way she held her daughter close, the trembling in her hands. He recognized that fear. He'd cultivated it in countless people over the years, used it as a tool to maintain control and distance. But standing there, looking at this frightened mother and her curious, fearless child, he felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. It felt uncomfortably like shame. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman blinked, surprised by the question. "Elena. Elena Martinez." "How long have you worked here, Elena?" "6 months, sir." She swallowed hard. "I've always been very professional. This is the first time anything like this has happened. Please, I need this job. It's just the two of us, and—" "What time do you finish your shift?" Alexander interrupted. Elena looked confused. 10 o'clock usually. But I can come back tomorrow to make up the time if—" "That's too late for a child to be here." Alexander heard himself say the words before he'd fully thought them through. "From now on, you'll work from 8 to 4. Adjust your schedule with your supervisor." Elena stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "I don't understand." Alexander didn't understand either. He was improvising, moving on instinct rather than calculation, and it felt strange and reckless and oddly liberating. "I assume the evening shift pays more," he continued. "Your hourly rate will be adjusted to compensate. And tell your supervisor to assign you to this floor exclusively." "Mr. Crane, I can't possibly—" "Consider it done," he said with a tone that ended all his business negotiations. Then, softer, surprising himself again, he added, "Children should be in bed at a reasonable hour, not wandering office buildings." Lily, who had been watching this exchange with great interest, suddenly smiled and waved at him. "Bye, Alex. Thank you for talking to me." Before her mother could correct her, Alexander did something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He smiled back. It felt rusty and uncertain on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. "Goodbye, Lily." As Elena carried her daughter toward the elevator, murmuring gentle scoldings and relieved prayers, Alexander closed his door and returned to his scotch. The amber liquid had lost its warmth, and somehow, the expensive taste seemed hollow in his mouth. He looked around his penthouse, at the modern art he'd purchased because his decorator said it was valuable, at the designer furniture no one ever sat on, at the state-of-the-art kitchen where he never cooked. For the first time in years, Alexander Crane noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful, just empty. And in that silence, he could still hear a little girl's voice asking him if he was sad. The question bothered him all night because he didn't have an answer. Or worse, because he did. The next morning, Alexander's head of household staff, Margaret, appeared in his study with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, something between confusion and barely suppressed amusement. "Sir, there's a situation with a cleaning service supervisor," she said carefully. "A Rosa Delgado on line 2. She seems quite agitated about your request to change one of her employees' schedules." Alexander didn't look up from his laptop. "Tell her it's not a request." "I did, sir. She's insisting on speaking with you directly. Something about union regulations and proper protocols." This made Alexander glance up. People didn't insist on anything with him. They suggested, they requested, they occasionally dared to propose, but they never insisted. Put her through. The voice that came through his speakerphone was tired and thoroughly unimpressed by billionaires. Mr. Crane, this is Rosa Delgado, evening supervisor for Premium Clean Services. I need to discuss this scheduled change you've demanded for Elena Martinez. What's to discuss? I've outlined my requirements. With all due respect, Mr. Crane, you can't just reassign my staff on a whim. Elena works evenings because that's when we need coverage for the executive floors. I've got other buildings, other clients, and a whole system that works. You're asking me to completely restructure. I'm not asking, Alexander interrupted. And I'm prepared to double your company's contract for this building to make it worth your while. Triple it if necessary. There was a long pause. You're serious? I don't joke about money, Ms. Delgado. Another pause, then a sigh that spoke of years dealing with the whims of the wealthy.
Fine.
But Elena will need somewhere to work during those hours. The executive floors don't need servicing until after business hours. That's the whole point. Alexander hadn't considered this. He looked around his study, then at the rest of his penthouse visible through the open door. She can maintain my residence. Your personal residence? During the day while you're there. Is that a problem? Most of our clients prefer privacy during their personal time. Then I'm not most clients. Alexander was already mentally rearranging his schedule. I'm barely here during the day anyway. When I'm working. She can work around me. If you say so. Rosa's skepticism was evident. I'll let Elena know. Though I have to say, Mr. Crane, this is the strangest arrangement I've ever made. You sure there isn't something? There isn't, Alexander said sharply, then caught himself. When had he started explaining himself to people? Just make it happen. He ended the call and sat back in his chair, wondering what exactly he'd just committed to. Having someone in his space during the day went against every instinct he'd cultivated over the past decade. His home was his fortress, his sanctuary from the world he had to navigate and dominate every day. Letting someone breach those walls, even a cleaning person who'd be easy to ignore, felt like a vulnerability he couldn't afford. But then he remembered Lily's small hand holding out that worn stuffed rabbit, her complete absence of fear when faced with a man who made grown adults nervous. He remembered Elena's protective grip on her daughter, the desperation in her eyes when she thought she might lose her job. And he remembered, with uncomfortable clarity, his own mother working 3 jobs after his father left, dragging herself home exhausted every night, but always managing to smile when she asked about his day. She died of a heart attack when he was 19, worn down by decades of struggle and stress. He'd built his empire partly in her memory, though somewhere along the way he'd forgotten why wealth had mattered to him in the first place. It was just supposed to be temporary help for someone who needed it, he told himself. A practical business decision with minimal impact on his life. He had no idea how wrong he would be. Elena started the following Monday. Alexander left instructions with Margaret that she was to have full access to the penthouse during her shift and that she should work undisturbed. He planned to spend the day at his office as usual, thereby avoiding any awkward interactions. That plan lasted until 10 a.m., when he remembered he'd left critical documents in his home study that he needed for a noon meeting. He entered his penthouse quietly, intending to grab the files and leave. But he stopped short when he heard singing, a soft, melodic voice coming from the direction of the living room. He followed the sound and found Elena polishing the windows that overlooked the city, swaying slightly as she worked, while Lily sat on the nearby couch with a coloring book. Elena wore the same uniform as before, but she'd added a cheerful yellow scarf around her ponytail that matched her daughter's dress. She was singing in Spanish, something gentle and rhythmic that he didn't understand, but that somehow made the vast, cold space of his living room feel warmer. Lily spotted him first. "Alex," she cried with delight, scrambling off the couch. "You're here." Elena spun around, nearly dropping her cleaning cloth. Mr. Crane. I didn't know you were. I thought you'd be at your office. We can come back later if… No, Alexander said quickly. Stay. I just need to get some papers from my study. But Lily had already rushed over to him, Mr. Flopsy dangling from one hand. Look what I colored. She held up a picture of what might have been a house or possibly a monster. With 3-year-old art, it was hard to tell. Alexander looked down at the picture, then at the little girl's eager face. It's very colorful. That's you. Lily pointed to a tall stick figure with what appeared to be angry eyebrows. And that's Mama. And that's me. We're all friends. Lily, honey, Mr. Crane is very busy, Elena said gently, moving toward them. We talked about this, remember? We need to be quiet and let him work. But he's my friend, Lily insisted with the absolute certainty only a 3-year-old could muster. Right, Alex? Alexander found himself in unfamiliar territory. He hadn't been anyone's friend in years. He had business associates, employees, acquaintances who wanted something from him. But a friend? He wasn't even sure he remembered what that meant. Yes, he heard himself say. We're friends. Lily beamed, and Elena looked at him with such surprised gratitude that he had to look away. I'll just get those papers, he muttered, retreating to his study. But he found himself distracted as he sorted through his files, listening to the sounds filtering in from the living room. Lily chattering away about her coloring book. Elena responding with patient warmth, occasionally breaking into song again. The soft domestic sounds he'd never allowed in his space before. When he emerged 20 minutes later, Lily was having a very serious tea party with Mr. Flopsy on the couch, using an imaginary tea set and speaking in a formal voice that was clearly imitating adults she'd observed. Would you care for more tea, Mr. Flopsy? She asked solemnly. It's the finest tea in all the land. Despite himself, Alexander smiled. What kind of tea is it? Lily looked up, delighted to have an audience. It's, strawberry tea. And there's cookies too, but you can't see them because they're invisible. Ah. Invisible cookies. The best kind. Do you want some? Lily patted the couch cushion next to her. You can sit here. Elena had emerged from the kitchen, her expression hesitant. Lily, Mr. Crane has to go to work. We can't. Actually, Alexander interrupted, surprising himself for what felt like the 100th time since meeting this child. My meeting isn't for another hour. He loosened his tie slightly and, in a move that would have shocked anyone who knew him, sat down on his own couch for the first time in months. I have time for tea. The smile that lit up Lily's face was brighter than any multimillion-dollar deal he'd ever closed. She immediately began pouring invisible tea into invisible cups, maintaining her serious hostess demeanor. You have to hold your pinky up like this, she instructed, demonstrating with her tiny finger extended. That's what fancy people do. Alexander copied her gesture, feeling ridiculous and oddly content at the same time. Like this? Perfect. Lily handed him an invisible cup. Now you have to say thank you very politely. Thank you very politely, Alexander said, and Lily dissolved into giggles. No, just thank you. You're silly, Alex. No one had called Alexander Crane silly in 2 decades. CEOs called him brilliant, ruthless, visionary, terrifying. But never silly. He glanced at Elena, who was watching the interaction with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was still wariness there. She clearly hadn't forgotten who he was or what he was capable of. But there was something else too. Something softer. I should let you get back to work, he said, standing abruptly. The moment had stretched too long, become too comfortable. Comfort led to attachment, and attachment led to vulnerability. But as he headed toward the door, Lily called after him. Will you come back for tea tomorrow? Alexander paused, his hand on the doorframe. Every instinct told him to say no, to re-establish the boundaries he'd let slip. Tomorrow he'd stay at the office all day. Tomorrow he'd remember who he was and why he'd built these walls in the first place. Maybe, he said instead. Lily clapped her hands together. I'll make extra invisible cookies. At his office, Alexander tried to focus on his meeting, but his mind kept wandering to his penthouse. He found himself wondering what Lily was doing, whether Elena had finished the windows, what song she might be singing now. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid for 10 years, allowing people into his space, his thoughts, his carefully controlled life. Caring about anything beyond his business was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet that evening, instead of working late as he usually did, Alexander found himself heading home at 6 o'clock. When he entered his penthouse, it was empty and quiet again, but something had changed. The afternoon light fell differently through the spotless windows. There was a faint scent of lemon cleaner and something else, something warm and lived in that hadn't been there before. On his kitchen counter, he found a note in careful handwriting. "Thank you for being kind to Lily today. She hasn't stopped talking about her tea party with Alex. Elena." Next to the note was a drawing, Lily's artwork from earlier, showing the 3 stick figures she'd declared to be friends. Alexander picked up the drawing, studying the happy, scribbly faces. Then, in a move that would have baffled anyone who knew him, he took it to his study and pinned it to the board where he usually kept important business charts and graphs. It looked absurdly out of place among the financial projections and market analyses. It also made him smile. Over the next few weeks, Alexander found his carefully structured life developing unexpected rhythms. He started coming home for lunch, ostensibly to review documents in peace, he told himself, though his office was perfectly quiet. The truth, which he wouldn't admit even to himself, was that he'd grown accustomed to the sounds of Elena working and Lily playing. The penthouse felt different now, less like a museum and more like a place where people actually lived. Elena had gently asked if she could rearrange some things to make cleaning easier, and Alexander had surprised her by saying yes. She'd opened curtains he'd kept closed for years, letting natural light flood the rooms. She'd moved furniture to create better flow, added small touches that made the space feel less sterile, a bowl of fresh fruit in the kitchen, flowers on the dining table he never used. "You don't have to do that," he told her when he noticed the flowers. "That's not part of your job." Elena had smiled, that same gentle warmth he'd seen her use with Lily. "I know, but it makes the space feel more like a home. Don't you think?" Alexander had looked around, really looked, and realized he couldn't remember his penthouse ever feeling like a home. It was a trophy, a symbol of his success, a fortress. But a home? That required something he'd thought he didn't need. Lily had no such reservations about claiming the space as her own. She'd established a headquarters in the corner of the living room, where she set up elaborate scenarios with her toys. Alexander found himself learning the names of all her stuffed animals: Mr. Flopsy the rabbit, Princess Sparkle the unicorn, Detective Whiskers the cat, and their complex relationships and adventures. Detective Whiskers is trying to solve the mystery of the missing cookies, Lily explained one afternoon, moving her toys around with great concentration. But it's very difficult because the cookies are invisible. "Naturally," Alexander said, sitting in his usual chair with his laptop. He'd given up pretending he was actually working during these conversations. Has he considered that they might not exist? Lily gave him a look that suggested he'd missed something fundamental. "Of course they exist, Alex. Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it's not real." The simple wisdom in her words stuck with him. He'd spent so long seeing only what could be measured, quantified, turned into profit. Balance sheets and market shares were real. Everything else was just sentiment, weakness, risk. But watching Lily believe so completely in her invisible cookies and impossible adventures, watching Elena transform his cold penthouse into something warm with nothing but effort and care, he wondered what else he might have stopped seeing. One Thursday afternoon, he came home to find Elena looking worried, speaking quietly on her phone in Spanish. Lily sat nearby, uncharacteristically subdued, clutching Mr. Flopsy. When Elena ended the call, she looked close to tears. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Crane. I know I'm not supposed to take personal calls during work, but my landlord. She stopped, pressing her fingers to her temples. My rent is going up next month. Significantly. And I've been looking for something else we can afford, but everything in the city is so expensive, and Lily's preschool is here, and if we move too far, I won't be able to get to work on time, and… She stopped herself, clearly embarrassed. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear about my problems. Alexander should have agreed. He should have turned and walked back to his study, maintained the professional distance he was famous for. Other people's problems weren't his concern. He'd built his entire philosophy on that principle. How much is your rent increasing? He asked instead. Elena named a figure that made Alexander's jaw tighten. He knew the Manhattan rental market was brutal, but hearing it in concrete terms, knowing this woman and her daughter might be displaced because of simple greed, triggered something he thought he'd buried years ago. Anger. Not the cold, calculated fury he wielded in boardrooms, but genuine moral outrage. Where do you live? The Riverside Apartments on 84th Street. Elena wiped her eyes quickly. It's not fancy, but it's been home. Lily loves the park nearby, and the neighbors are kind. My friend Sarah watches Lily sometimes when I need help, and she lives in the same building. Starting over somewhere else. She trailed off, overwhelmed. Alexander pulled out his phone and made a call. James, I need information on a property. Riverside Apartments, 84th Street. He listened for a moment. I don't care if they're not for sale. Find out who owns it and get me their contact information. Today. Elena stared at him. Mr. Crane, what are you? He held up a hand, still listening to his phone. Good. Set up a meeting. This afternoon, if possible. He ended the call and looked at Elena. Don't sign anything with your landlord yet. I don't understand. Neither do I, Alexander admitted. And it was true. He didn't understand why he cared, why this mattered to him, why the thought of Lily being uprooted from her home bothered him so much. But it did. By that evening, Alexander owned the Riverside Apartments. By the following Monday, Elena's rent had been reduced by 30%, along with the rent of every other tenant in the building. The building manager, who'd been systematically raising rents to force out long-term tenants in favor of wealthier ones, had been fired and replaced with someone Alexander's team had thoroughly vetted. When Elena found out, she appeared at his study door, her eyes wide with shock. Mr. Crane, I just got a letter from the new building management. They said my rent is going down, not up. And the repairs I've been requesting for months are suddenly being scheduled. Did you? She stopped, her voice breaking. You didn't have to do that. I know. Why did you? Alexander looked at this woman who worked so hard, who raised her daughter with such love and care despite facing obstacles that would have crushed most people. He thought about his own mother, who'd never gotten the help she needed, who'd worked herself into an early grave. Because I could, he said simply. And because no one should have to worry about losing their home while working full-time and taking care of their family. Tears slid down Elena's cheeks. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me. Alexander turned back to his computer, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. Just keep doing your job. But Elena didn't leave. Instead, she did something completely unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged him. Alexander froze. He couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him. Physical contact was something he avoided, another potential vulnerability. But Elena's embrace was brief and fierce, filled with gratitude and relief, and something that felt like hope. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what this means to us. Then she was gone, leaving Alexander sitting alone in his study, his heart beating faster than it had during any high-stakes negotiation. After that day, something shifted between them. Elena became less guarded, occasionally sharing stories about her life as they worked in parallel, her cleaning, him pretending to work while actually listening. She told him about growing up in Brooklyn, her parents who'd immigrated from Mexico and worked tirelessly to give her opportunities. She told him about Lily's father, who'd left when Elena was pregnant, leaving her to figure everything out alone. "I was so scared," she admitted one afternoon while dusting his bookshelves, books Alexander had purchased by the set but never read. 25 years old, pregnant, alone. But then Lily was born, and I knew I had to be strong. She deserves the best life I can give her. "She's lucky to have you," Alexander said, and meant it. Elena smiled. "She talks about you constantly, you know." Alex said this. "Alex thinks that. You've become very important to her." The words should have triggered alarm bells, should have sent him retreating behind his walls. Instead, they filled him with a warmth he didn't recognize and didn't quite trust. Lily, meanwhile, had decided that Alexander's life was lacking in several critical areas and had taken it upon herself to correct these deficiencies. She insisted he needed more color in his wardrobe and presented him with drawings of what she thought he should wear, suits covered in rainbows and stars. "You're always wearing black and gray and boring colors," she informed him seriously. "You need happy colors, Alex. Like yellow. Yellow is the happiest." The next day, Alexander wore a yellow tie to work. His board members stared but said nothing. His assistant Margaret did a double take, then smiled, a real smile, not the professional one she usually employed. When he came home, Lily noticed immediately. "You're wearing yellow," she squealed, jumping up and down. "You look so happy now." "I'm wearing the same expression I always wear," Alexander protested. "But you're happy on the inside," Lily insisted. "I can tell." And the strange thing was, she was right. He was happier. Not in any dramatic way. Not like he'd solved all his problems or found some grand purpose. But the weight he'd carried for so long felt lighter. His penthouse, which had always felt like a gilded cage, had begun to feel like somewhere he wanted to be. One evening, he came home to find Elena teaching Lily to dance in the living room, music playing from her phone, something with a Latin beat that filled the space with energy. They both laughed as they spun, Lily's little feet trying to keep up with her mother's steps. "Come dance with us," Lily called when she spotted him. "I don't dance," Alexander said automatically. "Everyone can dance." Lily grabbed his hand, tugging him forward with surprising strength for someone so small. "Mama, show Alex how." Elena looked hesitant. "Mr. Crane probably has work to do." "One dance," Alexander heard himself say. "I suppose I have time for one dance." Elena's smile was radiant as she showed him the basic steps. He was stiff and awkward at first, hyper-aware of her hands guiding his, of Lily giggling at his mistakes. But gradually, he relaxed into it, letting the music move through him, letting himself be part of this moment instead of observing from the outside. When the song ended, all three of them were laughing, breathless and bright-eyed. Lily clapped her hands together. "You're a good dancer, Alex. We should do this every day." "Every day might be excessive," Alexander said, but he was smiling. Later, after Elena and Lily had left for the evening, Alexander stood in his living room looking at the space they'd transformed. The music had stopped, but he could still hear its echo, could still feel the warmth of Elena's hands in his, could still see Lily's delighted expression. For the first time in a decade, Alexander Crane felt something he'd thought he'd never feel again. He felt like he was home. The transformation hadn't been sudden, but looking back, Alexander couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had become irreversible. When had he started buying groceries so Elena would have lunch available instead of skipping meals to save money? When had he begun clearing his afternoons scheduled twice a week just to be home for Lily's tea time? When had he stopped seeing them as his employee and her child, and started seeing them as what? He didn't have words for it yet. He just knew that the emptiness that had defined his life for so long was no longer there. It was early December when everything changed. Alexander arrived home one evening to find his penthouse dark and silent. No Elena humming in the kitchen. No Lily's cheerful voice narrating her latest adventure. Just the familiar emptiness he'd almost forgotten. He checked his phone. No messages. Elena was always punctual, always professional. If she needed to miss work, she'd call. A cold knot of worry formed in his chest, another unfamiliar feeling. He called her number. It rang 4 times before a tired voice answered, but it wasn't Elena. Hello. This is Alexander Crane. I'm looking for Elena Martinez. Oh, Mr. Crane. The woman's voice was strained. This is Sarah, Elena's neighbor. She asked me to call you, but I just got the message. She's at St. Luke's Hospital with Lily. The world seemed to tilt. What happened? Lily spiked a fever this afternoon. Really high. Elena took her to the ER, and they admitted her. They think it might be meningitis, but they're still running tests. Elena's phone died, and the hospital won't let her leave Lily's room too. Alexander didn't hear the rest. He was already moving, grabbing his keys, heading for the elevator. Which room? I don't know. She just said pediatric ICU. Mr. Crane, Elena's trying to be strong, but she's terrified, and she's all alone and… She's not alone anymore, Alexander said. I'm on my way. The drive to St. Luke's was a blur. Alexander's driver tried to make conversation, probably concerned about his employer's uncharacteristic anxiety, but Alexander couldn't focus on anything except getting there. Images kept flashing through his mind. Lily's bright smile, her small hand in his, the way she called him Alex, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She had to be okay. She had to be. The pediatric ICU was a special kind of hell. Soft lighting and cheerful murals couldn't disguise the fear that permeated every corner. Alexander approached the nurse's station, trying to project his usual authority, but his voice came out rough. Lily Martinez. Where is she? The nurse looked up, taking in his expensive suit and commanding presence. Are you family? Alexander stopped. He wasn't family. He was just a billionaire who'd let a 3-year-old into his life and somehow lost pieces of his heart in the process. I'm here for Elena Martinez. She's with her daughter. Only family is allowed in the ICU, sir. I need to see them. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. Please. The nurse studied him for a moment, perhaps seeing past the expensive suit to the genuine fear beneath. Room 412. But only for a few minutes. The little girl needs rest. Alexander found the room and stopped in the doorway, his breath catching. Lily looked so small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by machines and monitors. And 4-line ran into her tiny arm. Her usual vibrant energy was gone, replaced by feverish stillness. Mr. Flopsy lay beside her, looking as worn and worried as everyone else. Elena sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, holding Lily's free hand, her head bowed in what might have been prayer or exhausted despair. She'd been crying, her eyes were red and swollen, but now she just looked hollow, wrung out by fear. Elena, Alexander said softly. She looked up, and the relief that flooded her face nearly broke him. Alex, she whispered, using his shortened name for the first time. You came. Of course I came. He moved into the room, pulling up another chair beside hers. What did the doctors say? They think it's bacterial meningitis. They've started her on antibiotics, but they won't know for sure until the cultures come back. That could take days. Her voice cracked. She was fine this morning. We were playing and laughing, and then suddenly she was burning up and complaining that her head hurt. I should have noticed sooner. I should have. You did everything right, Alexander interrupted firmly. You got her here. She's getting treatment. That's what matters. She's so little, Elena whispered, tears spilling over again. She's my whole world, Alex. If something happens to her, nothing's going to happen to her. He didn't know if that was true, had no control over the bacteria invading Lily's system or the treatment fighting it. But he said it anyway, with all the conviction he could muster. She's strong. She's a fighter, just like her mother. Elena let out a sob and turned toward him, and without thinking, Alexander pulled her into his arms. She cried against his shoulder while he held her, murmuring reassurances he prayed weren't empty promises, feeling her pain as if it were his own. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, she looked at him with such raw vulnerability it hurt. "I'm so scared." "I know. But you're not alone." Alexander reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Over the next 3 days, Alexander barely left the hospital. He called Margaret and canceled everything: meetings, dinners, conference calls, all the things that had seemed critically important 72 hours ago and now seemed utterly meaningless. His board members were bewildered. His competitors wondered if he was finally cracking under the pressure of running his empire. Alexander didn't care about any of it. He sat with Elena during the long hours of waiting, bringing her food she barely touched, coffee she desperately needed. He made calls to ensure Lily had the best specialists the hospital could provide. When Elena finally dozed off in her chair, exhausted beyond endurance, he kept watch over both of them. On the second night, Lily woke briefly. Her fever had broken, but she was weak and confused. "Alex," she whispered, her small voice raspy. "I'm here, sweetheart." He moved closer, taking her hand carefully, mindful of the 4. "Did you bring the invisible cookies?" Despite everything, Alexander felt a smile tug at his lips. "I'll bring them tomorrow. A whole batch." "Promise?" "I promise." Lily's eyes drifted closed again, but she held onto his hand. "Love you, Alex," she murmured, already falling back asleep. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. 3 small words he hadn't heard in over a decade. 3 words he'd convinced himself he didn't need, didn't want, didn't deserve. 3 words that shattered every wall he'd built. "I love you too," he whispered back, his voice breaking. When he looked up, he found Elena watching him, tears streaming silently down her face. But these tears were different. Not fear or grief, but something else. Something tender and profound. "Thank you for being here," she said softly. "For caring about her. About us." "Elena, Alexander stopped, suddenly aware that he was standing at a precipice. He could step back, return to safety, maintain the distance that had protected him for so long. Or he could leap forward into the terrifying unknown of actually caring about someone, of letting them matter, of risking the kind of pain he'd sworn never to feel again. He thought about Lily asking if he was sad that first day. He'd been sad, he realized now. Sad and empty and alone, building towers of money and power to fill a void that couldn't be filled with anything except connection, love, the messy, beautiful vulnerability of letting people in. "I care about you both," he said finally. "More than I knew I could care about anything." Elena stood and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "I care about you too. I think I have for a while now. I kept telling myself it was just gratitude, that I was just thankful for your kindness. But it's more than that." "I'm not good at this," Alexander admitted. "I've spent 10 years making sure I didn't feel anything. I don't know how to." "None of us know how," Elena interrupted gently. "We just try. We show up. We care even when it's scary." She smiled through her tears. "You've been showing up, Alex. You've been caring. You're already doing it." Alexander pulled her close, holding her like she was something precious and fragile and impossibly important. For so long, he'd thought strength meant standing alone. But standing here in this hospital room, holding this woman while her daughter slept, he realized that real strength was allowing yourself to need people, to love them, to risk the pain for the possibility of joy. Lily recovered slowly but surely. The antibiotics worked, the fever stayed down, and on the 4th day, she was well enough to be released from the ICU. The doctors called it a textbook recovery, but Alexander knew better. There was nothing textbook about watching a 3-year-old fight her way back from the edge, Nothing routine about the relief that flooded through him when she opened her eyes and asked for invisible cookies. The day Lily was discharged, Alexander did something he'd never done before. He took a week off work. Complete radio silence. His board was scandalized. Margaret was worried. The business press speculated wildly about what could possibly have caused the notoriously workaholic Alexander Crane to disappear. He didn't care. He spent that week at the Riverside Apartments, a place his building manager had described as modest, but that Alexander found oddly charming. Elena's apartment was small but filled with warmth. Photos on every surface, Lily's artwork covering the refrigerator, well-loved furniture that had clearly been carefully maintained. He read Lily's stories while she recovered on the couch, her energy slowly returning. He helped Elena cook dinners, discovering that he actually enjoyed the simple rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring pots. He met the neighbors who'd become Elena's support system. Sarah, who babysat, Mr. Chin, who brought soup when anyone was sick, Maria, who always had spare ingredients to borrow. These were the people he'd overlooked his entire adult life, the invisible workers and service providers who kept the world running while people like him made money off their labor. Sitting in Elena's small living room, sharing a meal with people who barely scraped by but somehow had more joy and community than he'd found in all his penthouse luxury, Alexander felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of the world. On his last evening there, after Lily had been tucked into bed with Mr. Flopsy, Alexander and Elena sat on her small balcony, overlooking the city. The view wasn't particularly impressive, just other buildings and distant lights, but Alexander found he preferred it to his panoramic windows. "I've been thinking," Elena said softly, her hand in his, "about what happens now. You've been wonderful this week, but eventually you'll need to return to your life. Your work. Your world. And Lily and I, we're not part of that world. What if I want you to be?" The words came out before Alexander could second-guess them. Elena turned to him, her eyes wide. "Alex, I know it's fast. I know it's complicated. I know I'm probably terrible relationship material after 10 years of actively avoiding human connection." Alexander took a breath. "But I also know that I've been more myself these past few months with you and Lily than I have been in the entire past decade. You make me want to be better. You make me want to try." "What are you saying?" Alexander thought about all the speeches he'd given, all the negotiations he'd won with carefully chosen words. But this required something different. Something real. "I'm saying I love you," he said simply. "I love your daughter. I love the life you've built despite everything working against you. I love who I am when I'm with you both. And I know I don't deserve you, and I know I'll probably mess this up in 100 different ways. But if you're willing to give me a chance, I promise I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of it." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You really think you don't deserve us? Alex, you've shown us more kindness in 3 months than most people show in a lifetime. You see us. You care about us. Not because of what we can do for you, but just because of who we are." She cupped his face in her hands. "I love you too. I've been trying not to, telling myself it was impossible. But I do." Alexander kissed her then, gentle and tentative and full of promise. It was his first kiss in years, and it felt like coming home after a long time lost. When they pulled apart, Elena was laughing softly. "What are we doing? This is crazy." "Probably," Alexander agreed. "But I've spent 10 years being sensible and careful and alone. Maybe it's time for a little crazy." From inside the apartment, they heard a small voice. "Mama? Alex? Are you coming back?" They looked at each other and smiled. "We're coming, sweetheart," Elena called. As they headed inside, Alexander realized he'd finally found the answer to Lily's question from that first day. Was he sad? He had been. For so long, he'd been sad and empty and convinced that was just how life had to be. But not anymore. Now, walking into a small apartment filled with love and laughter and invisible cookies, Alexander Crane was finally, impossibly, completely happy. 6 months later, Alexander stood in his penthouse, though calling it his felt increasingly inaccurate. Lily's drawings now covered an entire wall that he'd had specially treated, so she could tape up new artwork whenever she wanted. The sterile designer furniture had been replaced with things that were actually comfortable and occasionally got crayon marks. The kitchen, once pristine and unused, showed signs of regular cooking and Lily's help making cookies, visible ones this time. The biggest change, though, was the people. Elena and Lily had officially moved in 2 months ago, and the penthouse had transformed from a showpiece into an actual home. Alex. Lily called from her new bedroom. What had been a guest room Alexander had never had guests to use. Can you help me? Princess Sparkle is stuck on top of the bookshelf, and she needs rescuing. Alexander set down the quarterly report he'd been reviewing and smiled. On my way. He found Lily standing on her tiptoes, reaching for the stuffed unicorn she'd somehow launched to the top shelf. At 3.5 now, she was taller and even more energetic than when they'd first met. How did Princess Sparkle even get up there? Alexander asked, easily retrieving the toy. She was trying to fly, Lily explained, as if this were obvious. But she's not very good at it yet. She needs more practice. Maybe practice closer to the ground? Alexander suggested, handing her the unicorn. Lily considered this seriously. That's very wise, Alex. You're getting better at adventures. I have a good teacher. The past 6 months had been the most challenging and rewarding of Alexander's life. Merging his bachelor lifestyle with a ready-made family required constant adjustment. He'd learned that 3-year-olds don't care about conference calls, that Lego blocks have a magnetic attraction to bare feet at 2 a.m., and that just 5 more minutes before bedtime was a negotiation that would put his toughest business deals to shame. He'd also learned the profound joy of reading bedtime stories, the satisfaction of fixing a broken toy, the sweetness of sticky kisses before leaving for work. His board had been shocked by his new schedule. He left by 5:30 p.m. every day now, no exceptions. Several executives had questioned whether he was still committed to the company. Alexander had responded by posting the best quarterly results in company history, proving that being present for dinner didn't preclude being effective at work. If anything, having something to work for besides just accumulating more wealth had sharpened his focus during business hours. His relationship with Elena had deepened in ways he hadn't thought possible. She challenged him, called him out when he slipped into old patterns of emotional distance, celebrated his victories, and supported him through failures. She'd also begun taking night classes in business management, and Alexander loved watching her confidence grow as she discovered her own potential. I spent so long just surviving, she told him one evening, working whatever jobs I could get, doing what I needed to do for Lily. But now, with stable childcare and you supporting us, I can think about what I actually want to do, who I want to be. Alexander had pulled strings to get her into the best program in the city, but Elena's success was all her own. She had a natural talent for organizational systems and people management that impressed her professors. You should come work for me when you graduate, Alexander had suggested. Elena had laughed. Absolutely not. I love you, but I need my own career. My own achievements. No nepotism. He'd loved her even more for that. Now, as he helped Lily set up an elaborate scenario involving Princess Sparkle's flying lessons, Elena appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple dress and the confident smile of someone who just aced a difficult exam. How did it go? Alexander asked. I got an A on my project proposal, she said, her eyes shining. Professor Chen said it was one of the best he'd seen. That's my girl. Alexander crossed the room and kissed her. We should celebrate. Celebrate. Lily echoed, jumping up and down. Can we have a party? A small party, Elena said. Just us. We'll order from that Italian place you love. With the breadsticks? Lily asked hopefully. Especially with the breadsticks. As Elena went to place the order, Alexander's phone rang. He glanced at it and saw Margaret's name. I should take this work thing. On a Saturday? Elena raised an eyebrow but smiled. 5 minutes. Then it's family time. 5 minutes, Alexander agreed. He stepped into his study, still his private workspace, though now decorated with a photo of Elena and Lily alongside his business awards. Margaret, what is it? Sir, I'm sorry to bother you on the weekend, but the Hartwell merger is falling apart. They're getting cold feet, and Chin thinks if we don't get you in a room with their CEO by Monday, we'll lose the whole deal. A year ago, Alexander would have already been getting his coat, preparing to spend the entire weekend crafting a strategy to save the merger. The Hartwell deal represented a significant expansion into Asian markets, millions in potential revenue. Now, he looked through the door at Elena on the phone, laughing at something the restaurant worker had said, and at Lily carefully arranging her stuffed animals for Princess Sparkle's flying school. Tell Chin to handle the preliminaries, Alexander said. I'll join the call Monday morning, but I'm not coming in this weekend. There was a brief silence. Sir, I don't think you understand. If we don't. I understand perfectly, Margaret. But I also understand that I haven't missed a Saturday family dinner in 6 months, and I'm not starting now. If Hartwell can't wait until Monday, they're not the kind of partner we want anyway. Another pause. Then, surprising him, Margaret laughed softly. You know, sir, I have to say you've changed. And I think it's for the better. Thanks, Margaret. I'll see you Monday morning. He ended the call and returned to find Elena watching him with a knowing smile. Everything okay? Everything's perfect. Alexander pulled her close. Work can wait. This can't. Later that evening, after dinner had been consumed, Lily had indeed gotten her breadsticks and wore more marinara sauce than she'd eaten. Alexander found himself in a familiar but still novel position, giving Lily her bath while Elena cleaned up the kitchen. Alex. Lily asked, playing with her bath toys. Are you my daddy? Alexander's hands stilled. It was a question he'd been expecting but didn't quite know how to answer. What makes you ask that? Sarah's mommy has a boyfriend, and Sarah asked if you were my daddy because you live with us and read me stories and fix my toys. And I said I didn't know. Lily looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes. So are you? Alexander thought about David, Lily's biological father, who'd walked away before she was born and never looked back. He thought about what it meant to be a father, not biologically, but in all the ways that actually mattered. Your biological father is someone else, Alexander said carefully. But if you want me to be your daddy in all the other ways, the being their ways, the loving you ways, then yes. I'd be honored to be your daddy. Lily's face lit up. Can I call you daddy instead of Alex? Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. If you want to. I want to. Lily splashed happily in the water. Daddy Alex. That sounds good. When Alexander carried a pajama-clad Lily out to the living room, he found Elena with tears streaming down her face, having clearly overheard the entire conversation. You sure you're ready for this? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Being a father is a huge commitment. I've been ready since the day she knocked on my door and offered me her rabbit, Alexander said. Then, setting Lily down gently, he dropped to one knee in front of Elena. Alex, what are you? He pulled out a small velvet box he'd been carrying in his pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. I had a whole speech planned, something romantic and eloquent. But the truth is simple, I love you. I love Lily. You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing, a family, a home, a reason to be better than I was. Marry me, Elena. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you've made me. Elena's hands flew to her mouth, more tears spilling over. Yes, she whispered. Yes, of course, yes. Lily, understanding something important was happening even if she didn't grasp all the details, jumped up and down. Are you getting married? Like princesses and princes in stories. Yes, sweetheart, Elena said, laughing and crying at once as Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger. Can I be in the wedding? Lily asked excitedly. You're going to be the most important person there, Alexander assured her, pulling both of them into a hug. Besides your mama, of course. That night, after Lily was asleep, Alexander and Elena sat together on the couch, her hand in his, the ring catching the light. I never imagined this, Elena said softly. When I took that job cleaning your penthouse, I was just trying to make rent and provide for my daughter. I never dreamed I'd fall in love with the scary billionaire everyone feared. I'm not scary, Alexander protested. Elena laughed. You absolutely are. But not to us. To us, you're just Alex. The man who has tea parties with invisible cookies. The man who learned to braid hair from YouTube videos. The man who sings off-key in the shower and burns toast, and stays up late reading parenting books. I thought I was being subtle about the parenting books. You have 7 of them on your nightstand. Alexander smiled, pulling her closer. I want to do this right. I want to be the father Lily deserves. The husband you deserve. You already are, Elena said, kissing him softly. You've been showing up, caring, trying. That's all anyone can do. 3 months later, they were married in a small ceremony in Central Park. Lily served as flower girl, taking her duties very seriously and only stopping to make a flower crown for Princess Sparkle halfway down the aisle. Alexander's business associates were scandalized by the modest venue and small guest list. Where was the society wedding, the networking opportunity, the lavish display? But Alexander, standing under a simple arch of flowers, watching Elena walk toward him with joy radiating from her face while Lily scattered petals with solemn concentration, couldn't imagine anything more perfect. His vows were simple. You asked me once if I was sad. I was, though I didn't realize it until you and Lily knocked on my door and reminded me what happiness felt like. You've given me a home, a family, a life worth living beyond just accumulating wealth. I promise to cherish that gift every day, to be present, to be kind, to be the man you deserve and the father Lily needs. I love you both more than I knew I could love anything. There wasn't a dry eye in attendance, including several of his toughest board members who'd been shocked to receive invitations. The reception was held in their penthouse, transformed into a celebration space. Alexander danced with his new wife, then with his daughter, who stood on his shoes as he waltzed her around the living room where they'd first had that invisible tea party. Are you happy, Daddy? Lily asked, using the name she'd fully adopted. Alexander looked around at the gathered friends and family, at Elena laughing with her parents, at the home they'd built together from nothing but kindness and courage and a willingness to try. I'm happier than I ever knew was possible, he said truthfully. Over the next year, Alexander's priorities shifted even further. He started a foundation dedicated to supporting working parents, providing affordable childcare, and preventing housing displacement. He funded it generously, but insisted on Elena's input for every major decision. Her experience and insights made the foundation far more effective than if he'd run it alone. He also began mentoring young entrepreneurs, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Having spent years as a fearsome figure in the business world, he discovered he preferred being a supportive one. The transformation baffled some of his old colleagues, but Alexander didn't care. He'd spent a decade being feared. Being loved was infinitely better. His company continued to thrive, but Alexander was no longer its sole focus. He was present for Lily's preschool performances, for Elena's graduation, for family dinners and weekend adventures. He learned to balance ambition with presence, success with contentment. On Lily's 4th birthday, they threw a party in the penthouse. Children from her preschool ran through rooms that had once been silent and sterile, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Elena's parents were there, having flown in from Brooklyn. Alexander's assistant Margaret came too, bringing her own grandchildren, and seemed delighted by the chaos. As Alexander watched Lily blow out her candles, surrounded by friends and family and love, he thought about the man he'd been just over a year ago. That man had been successful by every conventional measure, wealthy, powerful, influential. But he'd also been profoundly alone, locked in a tower of his own making, convinced that safety lay in distance and control. It had taken a fearless 3-year-old with a worn stuffed rabbit to show him how wrong he'd been. Real strength wasn't in walls and isolation. It was in vulnerability, in opening your heart even when it might break, in letting people matter even when you might lose them. Make a wish. Elena called to Lily. Lily closed her eyes tight, her face scrunched in concentration, then blew out all 4 candles in one breath. Everyone cheered. "What did you wish for?" one of her friends asked. "I can't tell, or it won't come true," Lily said seriously. Then she looked at Alexander and Elena and smiled. "But I think it already did." Later, after the guests had left and Lily was asleep, Alexander and Elena stood together in the living room, looking at the happy chaos of discarded wrapping paper and deflated balloons. "We should clean this up," Elena said, though she made no move to start. "It can wait," Alexander said, pulling her into his arms. "Let's just enjoy this for a minute." They swayed together gently, no music but their own heartbeats, in a room that had once been a showcase and was now a home. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked softly. "Trading your old life for this one? The freedom, the power, the simplicity of only having to worry about yourself." Alexander thought about his penthouse as it had been, perfect and pristine and utterly empty. He thought about his life before Elena and Lily, successful and solitary and sad in ways he hadn't let himself acknowledge. "Not for a single second," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "This is the life I didn't know I needed. You are the family I didn't know I could have. Everything before you was just existing. This is living." Elena smiled against his chest. "I love you, Alex." "I love you too." From down the hall, they heard a small voice. "Daddy? I had a dream. Can I sleep with you and Mama?" Alexander looked at Elena, who laughed softly. "So much for romance." "Are you kidding?" Alexander grinned. "This is romance. This is everything." They walked together to Lily's room, where she waited with Mr. Flopsy, her hair a sleepy tangle and her eyes already half closed. Alexander scooped her up, breathing in the scent of birthday cake and children's shampoo, feeling her small arms wrap trustingly around his neck. As they settled into bed, all 3 of them crowded together, Lily between them, Mr. Flopsy getting his own spot on the pillow. Alexander marveled at how completely his life had changed. A year ago, he would have called this scene impossible. Alexander Crane, the feared billionaire, cuddling in bed with a woman and a child, more concerned about a stuffed rabbit's comfort than his next merger. But that man didn't exist anymore. He'd been transformed by something more powerful than any business deal, more valuable than any amount of money. He'd been transformed by love. "Daddy," Lily murmured, already drifting back to sleep. "Will you tell me a story?" "What kind of story?" Alexander asked, smoothing her hair back gently. "A happy one." Alexander looked at Elena, who smiled back at him with all the love and warmth that had saved him from his own isolation. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that first knock on his door to this moment, all of them tangled together in love and trust and family. "Once upon a time," he began softly, "there was a man who thought he had everything. He was very rich and very powerful and very, very alone. He didn't know he was sad until a brave little girl knocked on his door and asked him if he needed invisible cookies and a friend." "That's me," Lily said, delighted even in her drowsy state. "That's you," Alexander confirmed, kissing her forehead. "And the little girl and her wonderful mother taught the man something very important, that the things that matter most can't be bought or controlled or kept safe behind walls. They have to be earned with kindness and protected with love and shared with open hands." "What happened to the man?" Lily asked. Alexander looked around at his bedroom. No longer pristine and perfect, but warm and lived in, with Lily's drawings on the walls and Elena's books on the nightstand and love in every corner. He learned to be happy, Alexander said simply. And he lived happily ever after with the two people who taught him how. I like that story, Lily whispered, her eyes finally closing. It's a good one. It's the best one, Alexander agreed, holding his family close. Because it's true. As Lily's breathing deepened into sleep and Elena dozed off beside her, Alexander lay awake a little longer, watching them in the soft light filtering through the curtains. His girls. His family. His everything. Outside, the city lights sparkled across Manhattan, the same view he'd stared at for years without really seeing. But now, looking at it with Elena and Lily beside him, it seemed transformed, not just a symbol of his success, but a reminder of all the lives being lived below, all the struggles and triumphs, all the families fighting to stay together, and parents working to provide for their children. Tomorrow, he'd work on his foundation's new initiative to expand affordable housing. He'd make it to Lily's music class performance. He'd have dinner with his family and read bedtime stories and help with homework and all the ordinary, extraordinary things that made up a life well lived. But tonight, he simply held them close and marveled at how a small child's fearless knock on his door had changed everything. Some people might have called it chance or luck or coincidence. But Alexander knew better. It was grace. Pure, simple, transformative grace, the kind that finds you when you least expect it and don't think you deserve it, but need it more than anything in the world. And he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for it, honoring it, and passing it forward to everyone he could reach. Because that's what love does. It transforms. It spreads. It saves us from ourselves and shows us who we could be if we're only brave enough to let it in. Alexander Crane had finally learned that lesson, thanks to a 3-year-old with a stuffed rabbit and a heart big enough to see past his walls. And he would never forget it.